The Atlanta Falcons made some drastic changes in the offseason. How do they all stack up against the New York Giants? We explore all that and more with Locked On Falcons host Aaron Freeman coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Trainer, credential member of the New York Giants media for Locked On, as well as for Giants on SI. Find my written work over at si.com/NFL/Giants. And as always, a welcome on into my Blue Crew community members, my everydayers, my newcomers, and everybody in between. Thank you for spending part of your day with us here at the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's show, we are continuing our look at the New York Giants 2024 opponents. And we have, for today's show, we're going to take a look at the Atlanta Falcons, who have had quite a bit of change and upheaval in their off season. And who better to talk about it than our very own Aaron Freeman, the host of Locked On Falcons. Aaron, so good to see you, my friend.
It's glad to be talking with you again, Patricia, about football.
All right. Well, we got a lot to talk about when it comes to the Falcons. And I think the first place we've got to start, Aaron, the Falcons with a whole new coaching staff. Raheem Morris hired as the head coach, new offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator. Let's talk about some of this newness and some of the things that you are starting to see as being different from the previous regime.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall it's a completely different energy in the building than it was under the previous regime. Arthur Smith, while, somewhat of a entertaining personality, didn't always present that in front of the media and whatnot. And so it created some tension, I guess you could say, at times because of some ways that he was a little bit more, I guess you could say, stodgy. And Raheem Morris is the exact opposite. Very personable, very likable. Every time he speaks, you go like, oh, okay, like I get why this guy is an NFL head coach. And so I think bringing maybe a little bit more of that sort of youthful, energetic energy into the building, I think is a big start. I think some of the coaches that he's hired, some young assistants, offensive coordinator Zach Robinson, one of the up and coming offensive minds in the league. Jimmy Lake is their new defensive coordinator. It's the first time being a defensive coordinator in the NFL, but was a very successful defensive coordinator at the collegiate level several years ago at the University of Washington. I think it overall brings a lot of sort of youth and energy into the building. And I think that's probably the biggest change. And the hope is that, that leads to the Falcons playing with maybe a little bit more energy, and especially in certain areas of their roster where they're much younger than they were a year ago, especially on defense.
What about schematically speaking? Let's start with the offense. How do you see this offense being different, under this regime as opposed to the Arthur Smith regime?
Well, Arthur Smith regime, his offense sort of had its roots in the Kyle Shanahan offense, which he learned from Matt LaFleur during his time in Tennessee. And the Zach Robinson offense obviously has its roots in the Sean McVay offense from their time in LA. So there's similarities. So it's not like it's going to be a completely different offense, but you're going to see probably a little bit more of a balanced attack in the sense of they're going to throw the ball a little bit more than they did under Arthur Smith. Arthur Smith just loved to run the football and be that sort of physical football team. So I think you're going to see this offense being a little bit more willing to air it out. They're going to play a lot more 11 personnel or 3 wide receiver sets, those types of things. But I don't think overall you're going to see a dramatic difference in terms of like it's a night and day difference, just because the roots of the Zach Robinson offense coming from McVay and the roots of the Arthur Smith offense coming from Kyle Shanahan, they originated in a similar place.
What about defensively?
Well, I think the biggest change is the expectation under Raheem Morris that they're going to go back to playing a lot more cover 3 defense, which they did quite a bit under Dean Pease when he was the former defensive coordinator in 2022. They changed that with Ryan Nielsen last year and went more to a 4-3 defense that played a lot more sort of too high sort of safety looks. And now they're going to be a little bit more cover 3. They're going to be a little bit more 3-4. the big question is going to be, are they going to be exactly the same kind of the defense under Jimmy Lake that the Rams were under Raheem Morris? It's going to be, the big question is going to be like, how different is the quote unquote Raheem Morris scheme going to look under Jimmy Lake with him operating it? And sort of some of the nuances and details of that may look a little bit different. But I think in general, this is going to be somewhat a familiar defense to some of the things that the Falcons have run over the years, with some elements from Dean Pease, some elements from Ryan Nielsen, and certainly going back to the days of Dan Quinn when Raheem Morris was an assistant under Dan Quinn. You're going to see some of that. So I think they're going to incorporate a lot of sort of familiar elements from Falcons defense from previous years. So it won't, again, be dramatically different than what we've seen from the past.
Now, interesting offseason in that you guys landed Kirk Cousins, who was coming off the injury, and also drafted Michael Penix. Did that surprise you?
Very much did. The day before the draft, I did an episode on Locked On Falcons, basically outlining why there was a 0% chance that the Falcons were going to use a top 10 pick on a quarterback. So that definitely came out of nowhere for me. You don't typically see teams invest the guaranteed money that they did in a veteran quarterback like Kirk Cousins, that presumably is locked up for 2 or 3 years, and then using a premium draft pick like a first round pick on a young quarterback, and then with the expectation that guy's going to not just sit for 1 year. We see teams do that all the time, where they'll draft a quarterback in the top 10 thinking, oh, he'll sit for 1 year and then he'll take over in year 2. But in the case of Michael Penix and the way that Kirk Cousins' contract is structured, realistically, the Falcons can't really turn the keys over to Michael Penix until year 3 at the earliest, just because of all the guaranteed money going towards Kirk Cousins. So that was a bit of a surprise, but clearly the Falcons' approach was, we've been in quarterback purgatory for the last couple of years, and we don't want to go back. And so Kirk Cousins is the short-term answer to avoiding quarterback purgatory, and Michael Penix is the long-term answer to avoiding that. And obviously a lot of questions will be answered. If both of those players wind up performing well, then everybody will, sort of forgive the Falcons for making the unorthodox decision to double dip at the quarterback position. But if that is not the case, then there will be a lot of second guessing.
How do you think each quarterback fits into the offensive scheme that they're looking to run?
Yeah, I think Kirk Cousins is a really great fit because he's basically operated in a similar style of offense for his entire career, going back to his days in Washington when Sean McVay was his offensive coordinator, running Shanahan styles, Kevin Stefanski style offenses in Minnesota when he first got there, and then these last couple of years with Kevin O'Connell, who also comes from that Sean McVay Rams coaching tree. So I think Kirk Cousins, we know what he is in terms of his fit, just because he's been in very similar style offenses and schemes for basically a decade. I think Penix is probably a little bit more of a question mark, but I do think Penix's skill set in a lot of ways is similar to Kirk Cousins. And so I do feel like he can be a good fit. We just don't quite know, just because, we're not probably going to see a whole lot of Michael Penix for the next couple of years. And so that's going to be a little bit more of a open question mark in terms of the long-term fit for Michael Penix. But I do feel like he is similar to Kirk Cousins in that he's a quarterback that typically wins from the pocket. Isn't going to be able to create a lot of off-structure plays. He's a much better athlete than Kirk Cousins is, but that's not really Michael Penix's game. He likes to push the ball down the field. He's going to have to get better at sort of short and intermediate passing game and improve his accuracy in that regard. But I think he has the smarts and ability to be a quarterback that can kind of operate in that quick game much more effectively than he showed in college with that sort of aired out offense that he had in Washington. So I think theoretically Michael Penix is a great fit in this offense. We just, we need to see it first.
You mentioned that, Arthur Smith, I think, liked to run the ball a little bit more, and that you're anticipating more passing. So where does that kind of leave Bijan Robinson?
I think Bijan is still going to be a big part of the offense. I think part of what happened last year with the Falcons having that sort of two-headed backfield was because of so much the offense was geared around the run. It was the idea, like Arthur Smith in his ideal world, he wants to run the ball, say, like 600 times over the course of a season. And like giving any one individual running back that type of workload would basically destroy that person's body. And so that was the idea of, we're going to have Bijan and Tyler Algier sort of sharing that workload. And I think now you're going to have a much lower workload that is going to be much more realistic for one player to carry the bulk of that. And so I do think you probably won't see a dramatic difference in terms of Bijan's usage, but you probably will see a dramatic difference in terms of Tyler Allgeier's usage, which will be music to the ears of fantasy football owners everywhere, because now Bijan's going to get the lion's share of the carries, and rather than that sort of two-headed backfield that was so frustrating to fantasy owners last year. But yeah, I think Bijan is still going to be the focus of the offense, and you've seen with past Sean McVay offense, I think the goal is kind of to get Bijan to be kind of what Todd Gurley was to the Rams, and if that's what he can be and be, you know, that sort of offensive player of the year sort of candidate. And we know Bijan has the talent to do that. I think this offense can do wonders for what Bijan Robinson's, you know, NFL stock could wind up be.
All right, we're talking with Aaron Freeman. He is the host of Locked On Falcons as we get a little insight on the Atlanta Falcons, who are on the New York Giants 2024 schedule this season. When we come back, we're going to have more on the Atlanta Falcons, so don't go anywhere. Hey, Giant fans, passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. So go on and keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay's Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and my special guest today is Aaron Freeman, host of Locked On Falcons. Does a great job. If you want to learn everything there is to know about the Falcons who are on the Giants schedule this year, check out his work. He's got all kinds of cool topics coming up, and he's done some cool topics in the past. So check out his work as well as all our hosts' work here on the Locked On NFL Network. And Aaron, when you look at this offense, just to stay with it for a moment here, where's the biggest concern for you right now in your mind?
Well, I think it is whether or not the Falcons have enough firepower at the wide receiver position that if their run game isn't operating and they have to lean heavily on their passing game, you know, do they have enough weapons to if they're going to be able to win games and they're going to ask Kirk Cousins to drop back, you know, 40 plus times a game, do they have this sort of firepower and explosiveness to be able to win consistently that way? I think the goal of the Falcons is to be sort of this balanced attack, that they have enough of a running game and enough of a passing game that when both of those things are working in conjunction, they have a complete offense. But if, you know, they get into games where they fall behind or they're forced to play left-handed or whatever, can they be effective being more of that one-dimensional team, as so many teams in the NFL and defenses are going to try to make you? You know how this goes, Patricia. Like, you know, defenses say we're going to try to take away the thing that you do best and, you know, make you play left-handed. And I think that's probably the biggest question right now for the Falcons. And while they have the other question I would have is, you know, how good can the run game be? Like, that's part of the issue that the Falcons had last year, which was they were going into the season expecting their run game to kind of be the thing that could carry their offense. And while their run game was fine last year, it wasn't quite good enough to sort of carry their offense. Now, I think because of the upgrade at quarterback, that won't be as detrimental as it was a year ago, when then they had to kind of rely on Desmond Ridder to have to sort of carry the offense, and he wasn't quite ready to do that. Kirk Cousins should be more than capable of doing that. But again, it's with the additions of players like Darnell Mooney and Rondale Moore, who were not necessarily super productive in recent years in Chicago and Arizona. You know, if the Falcons are going to need those guys to step up alongside guys like Drake London and Kyle Pitts, are they going to be capable of doing that if they become sort of that one-dimensional pass-only offense because of whatever reasons their run game isn't working, defenses are able to stack the box and all that sort of stuff? So those are probably my main questions right now for the Falcons offense.
How are you feeling about the Falcons' offensive line?
It's I feel pretty good about it. Like overall, their offensive line plays well. It's just the issue with their offensive line is there's just some games where they really struggle against like premier defensive players. Like last year, like when they played the Titans, Jeffrey Simmons kind of took over and dominated the first half of that game. Giants fans, I'm sure this is going to be music to their ears. If you go back to that week one game against Carolina, Brian Burns absolutely destroyed their offensive line along with Derek Brown. And it's just like individual, those high end players always seem to give the Falcons the biggest problems, and that wreaks havoc on their offense when their offensive line can't block those guys. But in general, when you look at the overall body of work, their offensive line is kind of the opposite of the Giants' offensive line, which is, they actually play well most weeks, but there's just a couple of games sprinkled in there where they tend to struggle, and you're like, our offensive line is getting their butts kicked, and this is a problem. I know, talking to Giants fans about offensive lines getting butts kicked is something like, oh, we know what that life is about. But it does become a problem at times. But I think overall, I think you feel good about the Falcons offensive line at this point in time.
All right, Aaron, let's take a look at the defensive side of the ball. I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but you have one cornerback set. I think it's Terrell.
Yes.
The other cornerback position, though, is still up for grabs. Am I right?
Yeah, that is correct.
All right. So how do you kind of see that, playing out this summer, that competition?
Yeah, that's going to be one of the more intriguing camp battles this summer. And it seems by all accounts, is going to be either between the Falcons' second-year corner and fourth-round pick Clark Phillips or the veteran in Mike Hughes. I don't think either one is an ideal option to be a starter, but I think the Falcons are hoping that the power of competition will raise the floor of whoever wins that competition this summer. But I think that's going to be an open question mark throughout the season, that even if there's a clear-cut winner emerging by training camp, by the end of training camp, whether that guy's going to play well enough in the season to retain that job for the remainder of the season, I think it's going to be an open question. So that is a position that I think is probably one of the bigger concerns on defense, is just, especially when you have offenses and quarterbacks that are like, hey, we have AJ Terrell, one of the better cornerbacks on one side of the field, and we don't know, this other side of the field is going to be a major question mark. Let's just attack that guy and see what he can do. And so that, gives that player, whether it's Phillips or Hughes, an opportunity to rise to the occasion, or to sort of be, the guy that can, be a liability, I guess you could say, when it comes to the passing game. So that right now is an unsettled position, and we'll just sort of have to wait and see if whoever emerges can be, a functional to capable starter this year.
Where is Grady Jarrett in his recovery from the ACL? I think it was he had.
Yeah, he's still working back from that. They're sort of taking it slow through OTAs, and he'll probably start training camp on a sort of a pitch count. They know what Grady Jarrett is, and so their goal is to get him healthy for week one. And so you'll probably see him limited throughout the summer with that goal in mind of, we just need to get him ready for September and not worry about rushing him out on the field in July and August.
So where would you say the strength of that Falcons defense is right now?
Well, because of the question marks, there's two open spots in the secondary at cornerback and safety. Although I would probably argue the two best players on the Falcons defense are cornerback AJ Terrell and safety Jesse Bates. So you would assume that that's the strength, but because of those two question marks, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag. And while you have two very established veterans in Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata right now on the defensive front, the other areas of the defensive line are open question marks because you have a bunch of young guys that are hoping to step up. So to me, I think the argument I would probably make is that linebacker is probably the position that is the current biggest strength. You have players like Caden Ellis, Troy Anderson, who's coming off an injury, but flashed some, potential before he got hurt, in week 3 last year. He was replaced by Nate Landman, a former undrafted free agent who was solid for them. So I feel like the linebacker is probably the position group that I feel the best about, not because it's where their best players are, but just simply because it's a lot more known what they have there in terms of the talent compared to some of the guys up front and the guys on the back end.
All right, Giant fans, we are talking with Aaron Freeman, host of Locked On Falcons. When we come back, we're going to learn a little bit more about some of the other new faces on the Atlanta Falcons and how they potentially fit in moving forward. So don't go anywhere. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you ever find yourself comparing your life to those you see on social media? Comparison is the thief of joy, and it's so easy to envy other people's lives. It might even look like they have it all together on their social media channels, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want to be instead of what others have so that you can start living your best life. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and designed to be flexible and suitable to your schedule. Fill out a questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And if you find your assigned therapist isn't a match, switch it anytime for no additional charge. So go on and stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to Locked On Giants. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and my special guest today is Aaron Freeman, host of Locked On Falcons. And we are learning a little bit more about the Atlanta Falcons, who are on the Giants schedule this year. Obviously, we still have to go through training camp and, have the 53-man roster set. There may be some injuries that change the complexion of the roster between now and the time that the two teams meet. But Aaron, let's talk about some of these new faces. We mentioned Kirk Cousins before, Michael Penix, but there are other guys that the Falcons, picked up via the draft, via free agency. Who are some of the guys that you think are really going to, play big roles for the Falcons this year?
Yeah, I think, on offense, they picked up Darnell Mooney, Rondell Moore. Those are probably the two biggest changes besides the quarterback position, adding some more speed at the wide receiver position. Two guys that are probably going to do their best work sort of in the underneath and intermediate routes and being able to maybe not stretch defenses vertically with their speed, but maybe be able to stretch defenses horizontally with their speed. On the defensive side of the ball, the Falcons added a bunch of rookies in their draft using their second round pick on Ruka Roro, defensive tackle from Clemson, their third round pick on Braylon Trice, an outside linebacker from Washington, and Brandon Dorless, their fourth round pick, another defensive tackle from Oregon. And then they use a fourth draft pick in round 6 on Georgia defensive tackle Zion Logue. So they've added a lot of youth to their defensive line, trying to keep guys like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, two older veterans on the quote unquote wrong side of 30, a little bit fresher. Both of those guys dealt with injuries last year. And so being able to keep those guys maybe on the pitch count, I think will benefit them. So those rookies are basically going to be thrown out there and expect to sort of use their fresh legs to keep those veteran players fresh. But outside of that, like the Falcons didn't really add a whole lot to their roster. Like their big free agent gets were, Kirk Cousins and I guess Darnell Mooney to a lesser extent. And then, of course, in the draft, you get Michael Penix and whatnot. So I think those are probably the big additions that I sit here and think are going to probably make the biggest difference for the Falcons this year.
Was there somewhere that the Falcons didn't address that you felt, gee, you're making a mistake, guys. You really need to address this area?
Well, for Falcon fans, this is the same song and dance with the Atlanta Falcons for seemingly 15 years, which is pass rush. They've had one of the worst pass rushes in the NFL for the last decade, if not the last 20 years. And while they did, add a number of young, talented players in terms of their defensive front to boost that rotation, not one of them, I think, is going to be the guy that you can expect will be a significant difference maker in year one. Like, again, the developmental potential of where those guys could be in 2 or 3 years from now, you like that. But in terms of being able to add somebody into the mix that can join someone like a Grady Jarrett or David Onyemata and be a force as a pass rusher, the Falcons didn't add. And so they're really relying on, third-year outside linebacker Arnold Ebiketie to make a big jump this year. Part of me wonders if, the Giants decide that they feel great about where Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau are. Like maybe they could shop Azeez Ojulari at the end of the summer to maybe allow the Falcons to get the former Georgia Bulldog to bring back home, and he would be a massive upgrade to what the Falcons currently have. And that kind of tells you the state of the Falcons pass rush, where the guy that's probably like the fifth best pass rusher on the Giants would probably be like the second or third best pass rusher in Atlanta. So that is one area where I wish the Falcons were a little bit more aggressive this offseason, especially in free agency, to add maybe some more proven options rather than investing in the future where you probably won't get a return on those investments until 2 or 3 years down the road.
Aaron, based on what you know about the Giants roster and personnel right now, which matchup do you think can sway the outcome of this upcoming game either way?
That's an interesting question. Ooh. I'll be honest with you, I haven't sat here and thought too much about the Giants just because the game is so late in the season
Yeah.
that it's like you
What
don't.
about receivers? Malik Neighbors.
Yeah, that my mind went to those guys, but at the same time, that defensive front to me is formidable. I've seen the Falcons really struggle to block Brian Burns over the last 4 years in Carolina. Kayvon Thibodeau, you got Dexter Lawrence. I think those guys can be a real big problem for the Falcons. Even though I like the Falcons offensive line, those are the caliber of players that I was talking about earlier that typically give the Falcons offensive line issues. And, if one of those guys goes off in that game, I think the Falcons will probably be fine. But if, two of them go off, then it's going to be a real long day for the Falcons offensive line and their offense. If, Dexter Lawrence is able to create that havoc up the middle and one of those two edge rushers is also screaming off the edge, getting those 2 points of pressure, I think will be a big problem for the Falcons.
You mentioned Brian Burns, you used to see him twice a year. Does that kind of give you guys a little bit of an advantage knowing him after seeing him so often?
I would like to say yes, but watching him still destroy the Falcons last year, it's like, well, we've seen him, I don't know, 8 times up to that, and he still was giving us problems. So I think the answer is no. It doesn't give me any sort of reassurance because he still creates problems for the Falcons even after 4 or 5 years.
And then final question for you, Aaron. As you mentioned, the game's a little later in the season, but what do you want to see from the Falcons, coming out of the chute as far as, the division last year was kind of, one of the worst ones. And what do you want to see from this new regime? What do you think they're capable of showing to kind of, set the stage for the matchup later in the year?
Well, the Falcons, like the meat of their schedule is really early on. It's very sort of front loaded in terms of week 1, they got the Steelers at home, then they go on the road against the Eagles, and they got the defending champions in the Chiefs at home in week 3. And then they have, I think, 5 of their 6 divisional games are like over the next 6 weeks. So it really is a front loaded schedule where the Falcons have to sort of come out of the gates and play well against some of the better teams that they're going to face, as well as win some of those divisional matchups. So my hope for this new regime is just they can get off to a fast start rather than doing the sort of typical thing that you often see with these first year coaches where they kind of ease their way into the season. And so I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for them with the way that the schedule is structured. I think when they get into the second half of the season, that's when theoretically that's the softer part of the schedule. But Patricia, as NFL seasons are so unpredictable that, teams like the Giants, teams like the Chargers, et cetera, that they're facing in the second half of the season, that everybody sort of assumes, they'll be sort of mediocre to bad teams, may wind up, being very good. And that will completely change the perception of how soft the Falcon schedule is. But I think getting off to a fast start is the sort of key that I'm looking at heading into this year.
All right. Well, it's going to be interesting. A lot can happen between now and then. Aaron, I want to thank you for coming on, giving us an overview of the Falcons. Giant fans, he is Aaron Freeman. You can find him on Locked On Falcons, as well as check out our other NFL hosts. We also have baseball hosts, hockey, basketball, college. They all do such a great job. Aaron, I want to thank you for coming on. Giant fans, thank you for tuning in. We'll continue our series looking at the New York Giants 2024 opponents here on the Locked On Giants podcast as we get you ready for training camp. For Aaron Freeman, I'm Patricia Traina. Thank you again, and we will see you again soon, Giant fans.